everybody. Happy Friday. Plan for today is to go through modules 46 and 50. We're talking about gender and sexuality development. Focus questions. We have discussed how the meaning of gender differs from the meaning of sex. Number 2, explain how gender roles and gender identity differ. And 3, synthesize what the research has taught us about sexual orientation. So that's our focus. I'm going to kind of give you the quick version of this. I would suggest doing some reading. There's a ton of interesting tidbits here. I'm going to try to make sure we just focus in on some of the terms and some of the big ideas, but there's a lot of good stuff in these 2 modules, so you should be reading. Let's start up at the top. It says gender has traditionally been thought of as a binary, either male or female. Think of like 2 buckets, and everybody is supposed to fit in one bucket or the other. And the reality is that is maybe not super helpful in terms of some of the complications and some of the complexities that we're looking at. So if you can start to think in terms of more of a spectrum, I think that's going to help you make some sense out of some of the stuff that we'll talk about today. I also want to just say that for some of you, I know that this is going to be like new material that you're like, I've heard a little bit of this, but there's a lot of new stuff here. And for others, it'll be like, I know a lot of this already. So, wherever you land in there, we're going to try to just make sure we're getting kind of the psychological take on some of this stuff. That being said, let's start with 2 terms, sex and gender. So in this case, sex not being a verb, but a noun. Sex is the biologically influenced characteristics by which people define male and female. So biologically influenced is the key terms there, right? Compare that to gender. It says gender is the socially influenced characteristics by which people define girl, boy, man, woman. So that difference between biology and kind of the social influences are really the core difference between the way we think about sex and gender. Sometimes people will throw these terms around and use them interchangeably, but they do mean slightly different things, even though they're referring to males and females. So for most people, those biological traits help define their assigned gender. For some people, not so much. And that's where things get complex. And so we're going to explore some of that. But let's start with this question. How are males and females alike, and how are they different? And your text gives you a whole lot of stuff. There's all kinds of research about gender and sex and differences. And like I said, it's worth reading because I think there's some pretty interesting information in there. But I'm going to try to sum up a couple of big ideas. First thing is we're more alike than different. 45 out of the 46 chromosomes are unisex, meaning they're the same in males and females. So if you identify as male or as female, your text says you give no clues to your vocabulary, your happiness, your ability to see, to learn, to remember. Males and females on average have comparable creativity and intelligence, feel the same emotions and longings. Like that list could go on and on, right? To make this interesting, there are some actual differences between males and females. And so, I'm in the smaller text as we go, I'm going to give you some of the nuggets that were in these readings, but, not everything. What are some of the differences? Females express emotions more freely. They can detect fainter odors. They receive offers of help more often. They have twice the risk of developing depression and anxiety. These are research-based differences. Males are 4 times more likely to die by suicide, to develop alcohol use disorder, to have autism, that should be color deficient vision, and to have ADHD. Those are all, again, statistical differences when we look at males and females. One of the things that your book focuses in on is aggression when they're talking about males and females being alike and different. And they define aggression as any physical or verbal behavior intended to harm someone physically or emotionally. And in terms of gender differences, men are more aggressive, and they give all kinds of studies on page 477, so you can read through that. They also define a related term, relational aggression, which is an act of aggression, either physical or verbal, intended to harm a person's relationship or social standing. And the text says that women are slightly more likely than men to commit these behaviors. They give examples like hurtful gossip or shutting someone out of a group or things like that. So, I mean, one thing you could walk away with, I guess, is that, regardless of gender or sex, males and females are both willing to be aggressive. It comes out in different ways or with a different focus. Maybe that's the way we can think about this. This relational piece is something that will come back up when we talk about gender differences later. So hang on to that. By the way, this is a video, so I'm going fairly quickly. You can pause me at any point and, process. So pause away. Next section is on social connectedness, and they start by telling you about some research by Carol Gilligan, and her name pops up a couple of times in the text. She's somebody that you should know. But in the case of gender, she says, the research suggests that males are individualists, whereas females are more relationship-oriented. We have several slides that kind of get into this concept. There's all kinds of research that kind of supports this. As children, males typically form large play groups with their activity and competition, and they have little intimate discussion. So think like flag football or something, right? As adults, men enjoy side-by-side activities, and their conversations are focused on problem solving. Anybody that has a dad or an old man around in your world, you're like, yep. That sounds about right. Side-by-side activities means you're doing something together. You're working on something. You're doing something where you're side by side, as opposed to sitting at a table, gazing into each other's eyes, right? One of the things that pops up in this section that I thought was particularly enjoyable is called the male answer syndrome. And the research says that men are more likely than women to hazard answers than to admit to phenomenon they don't know. So their example is, why is the sky blue? So apparently men are much more likely to BS their way through questions that they can't answer than women. Women will admit, yeah, I don't know. I thought that was humorous. Brain scans also show that there are no striking sex differences, meaning there's no like very big and obvious differences. There are some differences, however, and so what are some of the things that brain scans can show? Your text says a woman's brain is wired to enable social relationships, and you see this the way girls and women interact with each other. So girls play in small groups, often with one friend. They compete less. They imitate social relationships more. Teen girls spend more time with their friends and less time alone. Girls and women's relationships are more intimate, with more conversations that explore relationships. Both men and women report their friendships with women are more intimate, enjoyable, and nurturing. After reading this list, I think if you've been in the world ever, you're like, this seems to be the patterns that I've noticed, if you've ever paid attention to patterns. None of this seemed particularly shocking, but it is interesting that some of this registers on the level of biological differences, right? Brain-based differences. They also say that gender differences are most pronounced during adolescence, and then they start to get, those differences get smaller as we get older. So in the teen years, girls are less assertive and more flirtatious. In adulthood, after the first child, the gender attitudes and differences are at their peak. By the time you get to my age, men become less domineering and more empathetic. Women are more assertive and self-confident. And they make the point that women are oftentimes more assertive and self-confident based on some of the interactions they're having in the workplace, and that's allowing them to kind of take on some of these characteristics that were not necessarily traditionally female or traditionally, yeah. So that's kind of interesting. So what we're getting, big picture here, there are some physical differences between males and females. The next section talks about the nurture of gender. And so that, our old friend nature and nurture is running wild through this module, right? The text says that culture shapes our behavior by defining how we ought to behave in social situations. So while there are differences that you can see in brain scans, we can also see the ways that behavior is shaped by the culture that a person is in. So in order to kind of get through that, we have to understand some of these terms. So gender roles are expected behaviors, attitudes, and traits for males and females. Gender identity is our sense of being male, female, or some combination of the two. And the text talks about how social learning theory can explain the way that gender roles are taught and are learned. So social learning theory is the theory that we learn social behavior by observing and imitating others. That's Bandura's research. I think we'll get to that later. And also by being rewarded and punished for doing the right thing or the wrong thing. That is operant conditioning. We'll talk about that with B.F. Skinner later. So, this is how we learn about everything in the world. No surprise that we also learn about gender roles this way. If you can imagine a kid growing up and hearing things like big boys don't cry, being kind of told if you're a male, you're not supposed to show emotion, or being rewarded for, certain kinds of play if you're a girl. These are the ways that that adults will reinforce some of those kinds of gender roles. They then talk about the concept of gender typing. So gender typing is the acquisition of a traditional masculine or feminine role. And the research says that parents with traditional gender views were more likely to have gender-typed children who shared their culture's expectations about gender. And I can say growing up too, but also with my own children, raising kids, we kind of went out of our way to try to not do this. We were pretty insistent that we weren't going to try to pass on traditional gender roles if we could help it. And we had one girl and one boy. And so, I think there were some opportunities just built into that mix. And, it was interesting to see other people around us. My parents, for example, insisted at very young ages to make sure to give my daughter dolls and Barbies and things like that. And my son was getting very traditionally male type presents and gifts. And, the funny thing was then they would play together because they're the only two kids in the house. So they became playmates most of the time. And the way, they would trade toys. And so she was playing with the quote unquote boy toys and he was playing with the quote unquote girl toys. So, there were those kinds of opportunities, but I'll tell you a quick story. We knew these people that had similar age kids, and the mom of these kids, there were two boys, was talking to my wife and said she had gotten like a baby stroller and a baby doll for the kids to play with. And the dad came home from work and walked into the house through the front door, saw the stroller and the doll, and picked it up and continued walking straight out the back of the house to throw it in the garbage can behind the house. And, it was I don't know what his concerns were, if he thought somehow the doll was going to turn his son gay, or I don't know what he was worried about. I'm saying this with a smirk on my face because I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I had heard. Why would we have boys play with dolls if kids are playing with toys like that? They're engaged in pretend play. So why do kids do pretend play? They're observing and imitating others. Part of how we learn about the world is by imitating the things we see. So if a boy grows up to be a man and he ends up having a child, learning how to do child raising types of things and nurturing and all of that sounds like that would be something worth learning. I don't know that those kinds of toys are a terrible idea, right? It makes perfect sense. But this dad was having none of it. So that is something that's out there. I'm sure you might have some examples of your own people you know or people in your family, and it's one of those things related to how gender is kind of promoted. They go on to say no matter how much parents encourage or discourage traditional gender behavior, children may drift toward what feels right for them. And I will say that, both of our kids, despite the fact that we kind of went out of our way to not do traditional gender things, my daughter for a while was pretty like traditional girly stuff, and my son was traditional boy stuff. And, we were like, well, what about this? And kind of even suggesting alternatives. And they both kind of fell into those traditional roles on some level. I don't know that I would say they're super traditional today, but for at least a period when they were kids, they were like that. Other kids will move into kind of a more flexible place around gender. And so this is where the text gets into the concept of androgyny and transgender. And they define androgyny as displaying both traditional masculine and feminine characteristics. I think, we could probably think of some musicians or celebrities or people that, would be great examples of this. My go-to is always David Bowie, but there's a long list of people that you could think of. Transgender, we'll talk more about here shortly, but they define this in your text as an umbrella term describing people whose gender identity or gender expression differs from that associated with their birth-designated sex. It seems like a loaded definition. I have kind of an easier way to think about that here. The brain doesn't match the body is the language that I've seen. And that kind of made more sense to me. I was at a conference that was focused on LGBT stuff. This is from Lawrence Richardson, and I kind of borrowed his language because I thought the way that this was described made a ton of sense to me. I think cisgender is more commonly thrown around now. When I first started using this, it was a term that a lot of people really didn't know. I would say that, mind matches body, mind does not match body. That kind of helps us understand the difference. So there's variations on how this can play out, right? We will talk more about intersex coming up here, but that means that there is not conclusive sex characteristics, and that's coming up in the next module. So we'll put that on hold. But he also gets into gender fluid and gender neutral. And I remember the first time I saw these terms, and I was like, I don't know what that means. I was having a hard time getting my brain around what this looks like. And I know, sometimes these are the kinds of terms that some, I will say mostly men, have a problem with. And, I guess I don't necessarily understand this because I'm over on this side of the chart, and that is a concept that doesn't make sense. But if somebody is born and they have a gender identity that can be both male and female, they have that sense, or that sense that they're not male or female, those terms would make sense. And so I go, okay, I'll take your word for it, right? And just believe that is a thing. Why is it my position to tell you how you feel about your gender? That's, it's none of my business. So what you're seeing is here kind of a spectrum of gender, that it's not just male or female, right? That there's a lot of other kind of complexities that can be built in this kind of a spectrum. When we add on beyond that to the idea of a spectrum along the lines of sex, those physical characteristics, in terms of gender, that kind of identity, right? There's kind of a spectrum between male and female. Intersex lives in the middle of that spectrum in terms of gender. Gender nonconforming or androgynous could kind of live in the middle of gender self-concept. I guess androgynous is more about how you present. So that's gender expression. So that's kind of in the middle of this spectrum. And we haven't even talked about who you like yet. So there's a whole other layer on top of this. This is why this gets complicated. And I think for most people, especially if you're coming from a place where, binary thinking has just been kind of drilled into your brain, the first time you bump into this, it can be a lot to take in. When we break it down, I think it starts to make a little bit more sense. So that leads us into module 50. They start off talking about chromosomes and some of the kind of the basics of biology. I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit. The primary sex characteristics are those body structures that make sexual reproduction possible. Okay. The secondary sex characteristics are the non-reproductive sexual traits. So some of the other body parts, that should be female, body parts, male voice quality, body hair is what they list in the definition. And this is where that idea of intersex comes in. And we're going to actually watch on Monday, we'll watch a documentary that's a case study of a person who is intersex. And I think it's pretty compelling. The story is pretty compelling and actually pretty horrific if you really dig into the story. But that was, we've talked about how case studies are the way that oftentimes, people learn about these kinds of things. And so we'll have a great case study on Monday. But intersection, a condition present at birth due to unusual combinations of male and, apparently I can't spell female. My L's are missing. I'll edit this. Male and female chromosomes, hormones, and anatomy possessing biological characteristics of both sexes. So I think there's variations on how this can play out. So it either means it's not the child is not clearly male or female, or there's elements of both present. And we'll delve into this in more detail on Monday. The rest of the chapter really gets into sexual orientation and some of the research on sexual orientation. So they define sexual orientation as our enduring sexual attraction. And so they have homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, and what those terms mean. I think you've seen those terms before. What is some of the research on sexual orientation? I tried to hit some of the high points. Again, I would read through this section because I think there's some interesting stuff here, and there's a whole lot of research that's in this section, this module. So do your reading. But they start with just the idea that from culture to culture, there is a variety of attitudes around same-sex attraction, from accepting and open to literally illegal in some places. And so what's interesting is that regardless of whatever culture that we're talking about, they will find the same ratio of people who are either straight or LGBT, right? And so what differs then is how open people are to expressing their sexuality, or how hidden they have to be, how accepting other people are, has an impact on the way these things all play out. They also make the point that same-sex activity spans human history from the prehistoric era to the present. So this is not something that just sprung up in the mid-60s, right? This has been going on since the beginning of time. Psychologists today view sexual orientation as neither willfully chosen nor willfully changed. That's the text right out of the text, the quote. So that means you don't get to choose your sexual orientation, and you can't change it. They talk about conversion therapy and how that is damaging to people. So psychology has a little bit of a problem when we get into this territory, because it wasn't that long ago. I mean, probably in my lifetime I would have been a baby, but in the early 70s, homosexuality was labeled a disorder in the manual that psychologists use for mental disorders. So the field of psychology has actually shifted, I think, pretty significantly, but they have a pretty rocky history in terms of some of the stuff around this topic. Some of the other research, they say sexual orientation is especially persistent for men. Women's sexual orientation tends to be less strongly felt, and for some is more fluid and changing. Okay. Despite a lot of looking, research has yet to find links between environmental factors and sexual orientation. So this is where they go into some of the different myths. There are all these old myths about homosexuality and why it happened and what the mother did wrong and what the father did wrong, and it's all garbage that really doesn't have a whole lot of science behind it. They can't find those environmental things. They are able, though, with some of the new research, researchers are looking for biological influences, and there's a bunch of information there. So again, I would make sure you're reading through that section. But this chart identifies some of the things that researchers have found. So some of the traits that you'll see in terms of differences with gay and straight people. I've seen some of these things kind of in the popular news, right? Relative finger lengths. I remember seeing something like that. And then all of a sudden, all the guys, are like measuring their hands and doing things like that, which is kind of funny. But these things, if you look across data, they are finding that there are some differences in terms of traits. They also talk about brain differences in this part of the text, genetic influences and prenatal influences. And I would say, that while this is kind of interesting material, I think this is still, a work in progress. They say at the very end of the section that this is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I think, what researchers are looking for is to finally be able to prove that, if you're gay, you didn't just decide to be gay, that there's something that's built into the system that's, behind that. They don't know, what's going on yet. Someday maybe they will, but the double-edged sword would be then, if you can identify that thing, does that change? What if you can find out when the child is still in the womb, and you can do some kind of a test and find out, oh, they're going to be gay or lesbian. Does that influence what parents would do, depending on the culture you're in? That's kind of a scary possibility. So I'll let you read through that section. Tomorrow, like I said, we will watch the video version of this. This is the book that was pretty popular when it came out. It's now getting to the point where it's a little bit older, but I think it is a really good case study. It's an interesting story. It's a good case study of how we can think about gender, and that nature nurture question is going to come up. So that's the plan for Monday. Hopefully you have a good weekend. I'll see everybody then. Take care.